My name is Vaughn Rees. I'm a resident of Orange County here in California. I work for the Center for Inquiry West, which is the West Coast offices for CSICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigations of the Claims of the Paranormal, and for the Council for Secular Humanism. The first question I get time and time again is, what is a skeptic? Most people they're just not familiar with the word, except in a more negative sense. The best way I can define it is to say we're doubters. The doubting Thomases of the world. We demand evidence for a particular claim. We don't assume a claim is valid until there is something to support the claim. Part of our direction within the Center for Inquiry West and CSICOP is to promote science, reason, and free inquiry in all areas of human endeavor. The way we do that is by sponsoring lectures, workshops, seminars. We go into schools, libraries, we give talks on critical thinking. Critical thinking in terms of the real world, day-to-day problems that people run into, how to ask questions, what questions a person should be asking instead of just blindly accepting something as being true. Now, we're all victims to that. Even I will fall victim to that. I mean, I'm human like everybody else. But I'm also well aware of the fact that I do make those kind of mistakes. I do have those kind of biases, and I think that's what differentiates a skeptic, for the most part, from the non-skeptical individual, whether it be a UFO believer or a New Age follower.
The MUFON Symposium in general, you're here. Maybe you can describe a bit about why you're here and what you think of the symposium's proceedings this year in Orange County in general.
Since I've been doing a lot of research in Southern California on what's going on within the New Age movement, I wanted to also see how this is impacted by the UFO beliefs. And I find that there's a real overlapping parallel. When I go to the MUFON and go to their dealer's room, as one might call it, I see a lot of New Age stuff in there, crystals, alternative medicine type claims. And so I'm just wondering what the direction of MUFON is anymore. And although I think that may be a concern to even MUFON itself, because it takes away from MUFON's credibility. Although I personally feel they don't have a lot of credibility. They don't use the scientific method in the manner that it was designed to be used. You hear a lot of claims, assumptions, or conclusions drawn from assumptions or unproven assumptions, and that's not the way science works. Science, before it even makes a claim, it generally will pass or it'll study it in depth. It'll come up with a report. It'll submit that report to other scientists for peer review. That's long before it's ever published in any journal. And you just never see that, or at least I haven't seen any instances of it myself within MUFON or the UFO community. Generally within MUFON, the believers accept without question on the authority of the individual. In other words, they look at his documentation, his credentials, and they automatically assume this guy must know what he's talking about. They never go and critically examine the claim by, in science, we follow what's known as evidential reasoning, which is composed of a number of issues that we looked at, and one of them is the authority of the individual. What are their credentials? Have they done research before? Have they published that research? Where have they published that research? Has it been peer reviewed? Among other things, but these are some of the crucial things that we look into or have to look into before we determine that before we determine that the claim is valid or not.
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on some of which I've already heard, but hearing your thoughts on some of the other speakers that are here and how they might relate to this relationship between New Age and ufology, the scientific wing of ufology which exists. The first one that pops to mind is Dr. Steven Greer and the Disclosure Project. What your thoughts might be. You saw his lecture yesterday. You obviously know about the movement. What are your thoughts on Greer and the Disclosure Project?
I had heard Greer speak in the past, and I had gotten a copy of all his documents, including the CD that they're sending or making available to everybody. And what's interesting is in his disclosure project, Greer has assembled a group of individuals that have credentials. But the problem with in the way that I see it is that these people are providing testimony. Well, testimony, unfortunately, is very unreliable. courts have learned their lessons in the last few years about the unreliability of testimony. We do an experiment a lot of times with some of our lectures where we will have somebody run through, create a disturbance, grab something, keep on, and go out the other end of the room. Then we'll go back and we'll ask people to write down a description of everything that they saw. Inevitably, at least 8 out of the 10 people get it wrong. They either add material that wasn't there or they delete stuff that wasn't there. The courts are now beginning to recognize, in fact, most states now will not allow a conviction based solely upon a person's testimony. There has to be some other corroborating evidence to support the claim. And this is the problem I have with Greer and some of the other speakers down there. They're automatically assuming that what somebody's telling them is correct. Now, I'm not saying the person didn't have a real experience. For example, John Mack has come to believe that the alien abduction experience is a real experience, but he's basing that solely on the individual's testimony. And the problem I have with that is that people can fantasize. People dream. They can have very vivid dreams that appear quite real. I mean, I've experienced these myself, and I think most people have. And to automatically assume that what the person's telling you is a real fact, is highly dubious. It's bad science in every sense of the word.
During his lecture yesterday, I don't know if you were there or not.
I heard parts of it, right.
At the end, this young fellow stood up at the microphone and asked a rather pointed question that he had apparently contacted a number of the people that the Disclosure Project had, and Greer had said, we've talked to this person, this person, this person, this person, and I had heard this before too, and many of those people are apparently upset at Dr. Greer and the Disclosure Project, and they're saying that they've completely mischaracterized what they said and taken out of context what they would have told him. Had you heard of this?
The real problem I have is that time after time, these people have received so-called anonymous documents, anonymous letters, signed by individuals who ask that their name not be released or not signed at all. And they're using this as evidence to substantiate their claim. And that's a foolish way to do things. It's absurd. And yet, I do wonder why people fall victim to these claims. Why does a person of high academic standing step over the edge from what I would call real science that follows the methods of science, and start automatically assuming things without looking at the evidence? It's an issue that's been discussed, but I'm not sure there's any easy answer. I think a lot of it has to do with your early upbringing. We all have what one would call core or root beliefs, and these are beliefs that are things we've learned early in our childhood. These are beliefs that are hard to change. And if you do manage to change them, these people need something to replace it with. You tear out a root, if you don't put something back in there to replace it with that's comforting to people, then, they're going to fall over and have problems. So this probably explains part of it. Some of it may be that people are after fame and fortune, or more fame than fortune, because there is a lot of money in the movement, but probably not as much as we might think. I know in the alternative medicine movement and the New Age movement, there's an estimated $2 billion a year passes through people's hands just in this country alone. UFO movement, I don't have a figure on that, but I don't think it's as much, but it is substantial. But, it's hard to say. But one only has to go through your local bookstore and realize that the biggest section in your bookstore are the New Age section and the alternative medicine section. It's unbelievable. Are they really selling that many books? They must be, I assume. I don't know. I've never asked them outright.
Do you see differences between the kind of movement Dr. Greer and the Disclosure Project have and the kind of research and kind of researchers that people like Stanton Friedman and Kevin Randall, who don't agree on much, but they work independently, interviewing, whether we believe them or not, individual witnesses? Is Dr. Greer the wave of the future for ufology with his movement and as many people in this mass, the love, the applause, the carefully structured speeches with the applause points, and are guys like Randall and Friedman and others who've been around for a long time sort of, has it passed them by, do you think?
Well, I think the approach that Greer is taking is a more militant or a much more aggressive approach, and this seems to be an approach that works. We notice how effective it has been with some of the religious movements in the country, with Randall Terry and Operation Rescue, with the abortion issue in general. I mean, they can get a lot of people to appear by appealing to people's emotions, getting them riled up and worked up about things, and it's very effective. Now, that may be where they're going. It's hard to say. It really is. But I think unless MUFON makes some drastic changes in the way it does business, it's going to, I think, really hurt its future. I know right now I see the UFO movement kind of dying. I'm not seeing the interest in it like there used to be. Either that or people are just not admitting to it. The first thing I did when I came in here to this conference was to count shares. Just to get I always do that everywhere I go, even to our own events. I count heads just to get an idea. I was told that they were hoping to get 1,000 people here. They said they had 700 or 750, but I never got past about 350 to 400 people at any one time in their conference room. So I don't know what the actual numbers are, but it's clear that, at least from the way I see it, their numbers are slowly declining. And it may be they're trying to become more militant in order to get people attracted to the movement again.
Maybe we could ask you specifically now about Stan Friedman. I assume you've been familiar with him and his work for quite some time.
Right.
Because he's been around for quite some time. I know you were talking to him yesterday.
I've talked to him quite a bit.
And I overheard your conversation when you came up to him and talked to him about his lecture in particular. Maybe I could just ask you what you thought of his lecture in particular, and then maybe we could get into some broader things about his career and what he's done.
When I approached Stan Friedman to talk about the lecture, I approached him because I was a bit angry about how he presented it. There is a real problem within the UFO movement in ad hominem attacks. Rather than deal with an issue, they go after the individual or they go after a group. And I find it quite disturbing because it doesn't solve any of the claims. It doesn't deal with the issue at hand. It distracts and it gets people enraged. Yes, it does encourage people to get more involved in an organization. It's effective from a motivational standpoint, but it doesn't answer the specific question of whether aliens abduct people or whether they've landed here or whether the Majestic 12 documents are authentic documents and can be proven to be authentic documents. Stan, I like, in a sense I like him. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the gentleman. But what I've never seen out of him is any real genuine science research or scientific research that's been done along the lines of the UFO. I mean, what he's done in nuclear physics and other areas, that's a different issue. But I've never seen, reading his material, I've just never seen any definitive work that you can really put your finger on and say, oh, yes. First thing I did when I looked at his book down there, I said, well, where's your reference section? And I looked through there. Well, he has a list of sources, but he really doesn't have a reference section as such. Normally, when you look at a scholarly document, which is what I look for, is you'll look in there and you look for citations. Well, he went to the Journal of such and such, the Journal of Psychiatry, the Journal of American Medical Society for this information. But none of that seems to exist in most of these books, which creates a problem because it's hard to verify the claims that are made in a book. And it's not just his book, but it occurs in probably most of the people down there. Dr. John Mack, his books are the same. You can't find any, it's difficult to track down the sources. And another problem that I have with his book is that his sources that he provides, most of them tend to point back to other people that have written books on UFOs. And, okay, well, how do you know these people were correct? It becomes an endless change, and you can never go back to the original source a lot of times and validate the information that he has in there, which makes it very unscholarly, unscientific in every sense of the word.
Roswell, alien space crash test dummies, mogul balloon, weather balloon, hoax. Stan's, the first guy on the scene with Roswell. That's
right.
Sort of where his career got made. What's your take? What's your organization's take on Roswell and Stan's role in Roswell and what Roswell's become over the last 20 years?
Stan actually went out there, legitimately thinking that there was something here. I personally think it's a hoax myself. But, well, not a hoax, but I think the data has really been misinterpreted as to what was really there. Our organization feels that there was never an alien crash occurring at that location, or just out about 80 miles from Roswell is where it actually happened. The initial reports indicated that it was a weather balloon. In fact, the people that accompanied the items that they collected there and actually posed with a photograph, they actually confirmed, well, these were the items we picked up and took over. And of course, 30 years later, suddenly it's changing. Suddenly, these aren't the items that I had originally picked up. I know the military makes mistakes. They make blunders. We all put our foot in our mouth. And at this point, having served in the military, there's no reason for me to believe that somebody just jumped the gun and said things they shouldn't have said. I just think it's been blown out of proportion. Now, there's one of the issues that is very prevalent in the UFO community is the conspiracy issue. Government cover-up. Granted, government does not release all information, but I also know from my own experience in the military that the government can't keep secrets very well. Ultimately, the stuff leaks out. Maybe not the documents, but ultimately it does leak out. And to this date, there's been no real smoking gun that's come out of the information that has been released or that's been supposedly overheard by people that would dispel my beliefs that it's anything but a misinterpreted event.
What's your take on alien visitations, then? The concept of extraterrestrial life, whether it's the Roswell crash or Bud Hopkins with his abductions or anything. Is there anything out there? Have you ever seen any evidence that leads you to believe, on the balance of probabilities, as we lawyers would say, that it's more likely than not that we're being visited or that there is extraterrestrial life somewhere, even if they're not visiting here? Is there a possibility, or is it something you folks have ruled out?
No, we do not rule out the possibility. One thing about science is tentative in its claims. It always leaves room for error because new information comes up that replaces old information. That's one of the most important aspects of science is the fact that this does occur. You have peer review, and people have to validate later by replicating the experiment. But the probability that aliens have been here, in my opinion, are quite small. And the reason for that is because they would have to overcome overwhelming physical constraints based upon the laws of physics to get here. There's been a lot of talk about time warps. I think a lot of this came out of the Star Wars movies. Up until then, that word was never around. The problem with some of these claims is that, to time warp or to warp space would require more energy than space has available to us. Theoretically, you can say a lot of things can happen, but that's theoretically. But when you get to the practical aspect of it, we just don't have that means, at least at this point. So yes, it's possible, but it's just really a very small probability that aliens have ever visited us. We're just one out of billions and billions and billions of planets, suns, and what have you that are floating around out there. To me, just to find us would be a miracle, much less to actually get here in a spacecraft. I just find it highly improbable, but I'm not ruling it out. A lot of things are possible. Science changes. Our ideas and the way we approach things changes, but, they talk about paradigms and changing paradigms and being really creative. Change in paradigms come from new discoveries. New discoveries are built upon old discoveries. So you can't rule out the past. Who was saying that today? I think it was Greer, but I just can't absolutely be sure at this point that the future is not built upon the past. Well, that's not true. That's not true at all.
Some of the, obviously people like Stan are serious people, but when you look at the crowd down there, what is driving these people, both in the ufological movement and in the New Age movement? Why are they showing, even in declining numbers, what are these people looking for when they come to hear people like John Mack speak or Barry Downing or even Stanton Friedman or Greer? What's driving all of this?
I've been doing a lot of research in Southern California on the New Age movement, and I see the same parallels in there as with the UFO community. During one of the talks yesterday, there's a guy talking about the Bible and spaceships, and I can't think of his name offhand. He asked people to raise their hand in regards to, how many people believe in a God, or the God of Moses. And what was interesting is the number of people that rose their hand, which is relatively small. I'd say a little less than half the audience raised their hand, which leads me to believe that a lot of the motivation has to do with their preconceived belief systems. They're looking for something spiritual, something beyond. They may not believe in a God. A lot of these people I've discovered are agnostic, and many of them would call themselves as atheists. And I think that they're searching for something spiritual that they don't have in their life. They can't necessarily accept the idea of a God, but they might better deal with the idea that an alien came here and planted humans on this planet sometime in the distant past. And in some cases, the people are probably outright nuts. I hate to say that. I think in most cases, these people honestly believe that these things are occurring, have occurred, or they've had these experiences. I don't doubt that, but I don't think that they're interpreting what they're experiencing correctly in all cases. You know, I have a good background on how the mind operates and how we make errors in our reasoning, how we misinterpret information, which most of these people don't have. MUFON does not have much in the way of educational programs for its members. You know, you bring in instructors, you teach classes or put on workshops on psychology, on gathering evidence, on biology, chemistry, whatever it may be, atmospheric phenomena, photography. This is something that PsyCop does all year round. And it makes a difference because, you know, it's easy to be a believer because being a believer doesn't require or does not necessarily require any evidence. Being a skeptic is difficult because we become a jack of all trades. We got to go out and learn a little bit about physics, learn a little bit about biology, evolution, paleontology, photography, forensic, gathering information. So it makes it really difficult to be a skeptic. Trying to get this material and learn it in a relatively reasonable amount of time is difficult. Most skeptics that are reasonably knowledgeable about skepticism have spent years learning this stuff, taking classes on the side, going to these workshops. It's not an easy process being a skeptic. And the public has a general misconception about what a skeptic is anyways. Most people see it as a derogatory word. But skeptics aren't like that. Skeptics are very open-minded, but they're not so open-minded that either your brain falls out or the wind just keeps going through. It never stops. Or everything just enters up there and never leaves. So I think that probably explains a lot of what's going on down there. But I'm not sure that the UFO movement overall recognizes the problems that exist within their own movement. And they're their own worst enemy. And unless they make some major changes in the way they manage their program, they may fade away. There's a lot of little small splinter groups up there. They start out as big groups and ultimately disappear to where there's just a handful. The Billy Meier incident that happened in 1981 over in Europe is a good example. Billy Meier, had supposedly had contact with this group of aliens from the Pleiades, which is 54, I think, light years from here. Well, 1 light year is approximately 6 trillion miles. The speeds, of course, we travel these days. Well, you'll never get there in 100 or 1,000 lifetimes. Well, initially, they had a big following, but now it's just dwindled down to, in Los Angeles, they have a group that's got maybe 4 or 5 people. That's all that's left. Most people in Europe could care less about them, and they know it's a hoax. And it's been shown to be a hoax. And I think this may ultimately be the demise of MUFON and the other UFO groups unless they change the way they do science.
Okay, is there anything you'd like to add or something we've covered you'd like to add upon or anything else at all? Give me a chance.
The only thing I can think of pointing out is that it's important for people to be skeptical of any claim, no matter what it is, no matter how much evidence is available. They should take the time, especially if it's a claim that could affect their well-being, their finances, their health. Take the time to investigate it. Science asks the question how, and that's the first question that should be on people's minds. Well, how does this work? How do you know that? If you wanted to get into the issues of why, then you go to the philosophers and the theologians. Science is not, science is interested in understanding how the world operates. Not necessarily why. Sometimes the answer the answer to why it works comes out ultimately once we discover how the process works.